Well, welcome back. This is our third video as we are coming to the second rule that John Owen lays down in duties of Christian fellowship. Again, I just remind you that as we work through these rules, that the first seven chiefly apply to the congregation's duties to their pastor, and then the following rules after that, 8 and following, will be the congregation's duties to one another. It's a great joy to be doing this. I hope you have found it profitable. And so with no further ado, we'll just dive into the third rule. And so the second rule that Owen lays out here is that he says the pastor's way of life is to be observed and carefully followed to the extent that he walks in the ways of Jesus Christ. So Owen lays down here this very solid and biblical truth that not only are pastors to have a ministry of the word in speaking and in preaching, but that the very life of a minister must also be exemplary and must serve as a model for how Christians are to live. If you were with us last time and you read through the list of qualifications that Paul lays down in 1 Timothy 3 for the office of elder, you will note that the vast majority of qualifications have to do with one's conduct. Sometimes, particularly in Reformed circles, we can put a heavy emphasis on theology and doctrine and teaching. But the emphasis that the Bible lays down is that whereas those things are important, there are far more qualifications that touch on the way in which a minister lives, the way in which he conducts himself with his family, with his children, with his wife, even to those who are outside the church. And so Owen picks up on this biblical theme, this biblical idea, and the second rule that he shows for the duties of Christian fellowship is that the pastor's way of life is to be observed and carefully followed when he is in conformity to Christ. Now, Owen lays down a couple proof texts here. We'll come in just a minute and deal with most of those, or some of those other ones, as we expand on what Owen says and take this in a couple practical suggestions. But just by way of a couple points here, 1 Corinthians 4:16, Paul told the church in Corinth, "I urge you then, be imitators of me." Similarly, in Hebrews 13, verse 7, the preacher of Hebrews says, "Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith." And then as Peter admonished elders, he said that they are to be being examples to the flock. So Owen's second rule here is that the pastor's way of life is to be observed. Now, as Owen details this, he draws both from the Old Testament, he explains it, he draws both from the Old Testament and from the New Testament. And the most of this short rule and chapter are taken up where Owen explains that this was seen clearly in the Old Testament, in the way that the priests, the Levitical tribe, was set apart from the rest of the tribes, and what they were called to wear, that they were to wear their priestly vestments, their garments, their ephods, their robes, right? Now, all of these things, as they were tied to the tabernacle and to the temple, Owen rightly notes that first and foremost they were types of Jesus Christ. These priests pointed to the office of Christ's priesthood. But he notes as well that they served as an example to the Israelites. That as these priests dressed in these special garments, that they were worn to reflect the priest's holiness, that these priests were to stand out from the rest of the congregation. And as we come into the New Testament, we don't think that pastors are priests, nor do we think that they need to wear outward garments, physical clothes, but that by their conduct and the way in which they live, they are to reflect a holiness about themselves that ought to be contagious and imitated by those who sit under their authority in their teaching and preaching. And so Owen shows this, right, that under the New Testament, that Paul warns and admonishes many times that ministers need to watch themselves so that what they preach is not discredited by the way in which they live. And we see a number of texts in the New Testament that highlight this very point. Right? You think even of Paul himself, that as Paul was again writing to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, that even this super apostle, if you will, the apostle Paul, who, just amazing man of God, an amazing faith, and yet what does he tell the church in Corinth? He says, "But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Right? So this was a principle that Paul lived by, that he needed to discipline his own body, that he needed to bring it under subjection to himself, lest after preaching the good news, he himself should be disqualified from the very grace that he was preaching and found in Jesus Christ. We also remember that Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, that as he's beginning to speak of these spiritual gifts and everything, that he tells the church, right, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." I'm going to come to this point and unfold a little bit. Owen doesn't really touch on it here, but it is worth noting. The great humility, that Paul was clothed in to say that. I know that might initially sound very arrogant and prideful, and yet when we think about it, it is a very humbling position for one like Paul or even a minister to be in, but we'll come to that in just a moment. Similarly, as Paul was encouraging young Timothy, who was a pastor, an elder in the church of Ephesus, all right, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12 and 16, Paul tells Timothy, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct and love and faith and purity. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in doing this, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers." Right? So Paul, very, very interesting there, that he commands Timothy. He doesn't command the church in Ephesus. He doesn't say, "Look, don't look down on young Timothy." Right? Likely there was a temptation, even in a church like Ephesus, that they were looking down on one who was seemingly young and inexperienced as Timothy was. And perhaps this was a discouragement to Timothy. We don't know the interactions between Timothy and Paul, but you do know that Paul's command comes to Timothy. That Timothy, you are to give nobody any reason to look down on you, but rather you are to set an example. And he notes they're an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Right? And all of these things he must watch himself carefully, not only for his sake, but also for the sake of his people. So Paul tells young Timothy that he must live by these things. Paul commanded not just young Timothy, but as well all elders to keep a close watch on themselves. In Acts chapter 20, verse 28, interesting again that Paul is addressing the elders in Ephesus here, as he was addressing their pastor later on. But in Acts chapter 20, verse 28, Paul tells the elders in Ephesus, right, "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood." All right, so Paul is telling all elders here, you need to watch your conduct. You need to watch your conduct as good shepherds, because you know that you are going to be an example to those that you teach. Right, so the principle here, the rule that that Owen lays down here, is that that ministers, though their conduct, their way of life, must be exemplified, must be lived out, must be seen as an example by the congregation. Now that is about the last point of explanation that Owen makes. But I want to just spend a couple minutes pastorally and practically reflecting on this with you. Because as I said, this is perhaps a relatively unique rule that Owen lays down. Owen doesn't necessarily cover this, but we need to realize the great humility that it is for pastors to be examples to their flock. Right, again, as I had noted earlier, that this could initially sound like it has a lot of arrogance and pride to it, right? A man might puff himself up and say, oh, you need to follow me, I'm the pastor, look at everything, how cool I am, I want to be an example for people. But if your pastor has a reasonable understanding of the sin that dwells in his own heart, and the sin of other people, and his own insufficiency and inability to reflect the glory of Christ in the way that Christ deserves. This is a very humbling thing for Paul to tell the church, or for ministers to live their lives in a way that they serve as a model or as an example. And one thing that we're taught in seminary is that when you become a pastor, you must be prepared to live in a glass house, right? That everybody's eyes are going to be upon you, that you're going to be scrutinized, that they are going to turn over every leaf and every rock in your life and in your dealings with people, that you are going to be held to much higher expectations than other people are held to, than other Christians are held to. Right? In the pastoral office, it is legitimate to say that there are sins that, though in and of themselves are heinous enough, that there are particular sins that can disqualify a man from the ministry for the remainder of his life. And if a congregant were to commit that sin, yes, it'd be sinful and be grievous. He wouldn't lose his job. He wouldn't lose the church. He wouldn't lose, the income that comes with all of this. He wouldn't lose the office. Right? So ministers, right? This is a great, humbling thing to realize that pastors live in a glass house. That people, continually keep their eye on them. We haven't gone over the questions for consideration and discussion. The Banner of Truth has included in their edition of this book. But one of the questions that they ask, which I thought was really informative, is they said, put yourself in your pastor's shoes. What pressures and stresses would you experience knowing that the eye of the church was upon you? Living as a pastor and in this glass house is a very, very humbling thing. It is not something that any God-fearing minister would ever take advantage of and puff himself up in arrogance and pride and tout his own abilities, but one which again drives godly pastors to their knees before the Lord, pleading for the mercy that they need to live in a manner that is worthy of the gospel and of the specific call that they have received to preach the gospel. So Owen doesn't weigh into that, but we should acknowledge that and consider that. The next rule is going to deal with praying for your pastor. And this would be one reason why he needs a lot of prayer, because it is a very humbling thing to know that their lives are being lived before their congregation, that they are examples by their conduct of what they preach. But again, Owen doesn't cover this particular aspect, but it is good to note as well. Not only is this require great humility from the pastor, but this requires a lot of grace from congregants as well. Right? That they need to see that their pastors, that their elders, are examples to them of how they ought to live. Now, we've noted that one of Timothy's struggles in the church is that people were not honoring him. All right? That they were looking down on him because of his age and his inexperience. Even this man who was single-handedly drafted by the Apostle Paul, and who was Paul's spiritual child, and yet the church had a temptation to look down on him. But not only do churches have a temptation to look down on their pastors, but I think it's equally and perhaps even more so true that oftentimes congregants can kind of brush off their pastors, not seeing them as an example, but saying things like, well, of course, this is their job. This is what they're supposed to be doing. Right? So when a pastor or his wife, deal charitably with people, right? Say a congregant gets really, really mad and there's this public fight going on, and the pastor, in great humility takes the higher ground, right? That it could be easy for a congregant to say, well, yeah, he's the pastor. He needs to take the higher ground. This is his position. This is what he signed up for, was to get all this criticism, right? But when it comes to people criticizing me, I'm going to get vengeance. I'm going to be frustrated here. No. Your pastor taking the high ground in that is meant to be an example to you of how you deal with people when they get unjustly frustrated and even angry with you. I remember a number of years ago talking to a minister, not in our denomination, but in another one. I asked him how his ministry was going. And he said, my ministry is really, really difficult. He said, my people really view me as the professionally paid Christian. Right? That he said in his case, he was expected to do everything so that nobody else would have to do anything. And that is a challenge that many pastors face. Again, it's the professionalization of the ministry. We're paying somebody to do this. We're paying somebody to call the shut-ins. We're paying somebody, to show hospitality. We're paying somebody to, fill in the blank. And oftentimes people can think they're absolved from this, but a lot of grace needs to be shown here by congregants, that when you see your pastors or your elders doing something that is commendable or praiseworthy or godly, it's not to alleviate you of those responsibilities, but to encourage you so that you, as they are following Christ, so you can follow them as well and flourish. At a very personal level, when it comes to Providence, this is the way that your elders view the fellowship meal that we have on the last Sunday of every month. That we do this as an example of how we can show hospitality. And we hope that you don't just wash your hands of hospitality the rest of the month and say, well, we got our fellowship meal in, now we're good to go for the month. But rather to use this as an example of, this is how you show hospitality. This is how you can engage people. This is how you can, meet people and fellowship with them over a meal. A lot of grace needs to come from congregants, that they need to know that the way in which their pastor and their elders live, that it is meant to be imitated and that it is meant to be emulated. And a third practical issue that Owen doesn't deal with, but is still worth just addressing briefly, is what do you do as a congregant when your pastor is not living above reproach? I know as well as every pastor the sin that still dwells in my mind, my heart, my words, and my actions. All right, and unfortunately, I don't live a wholly perfect, consistent life with what I preach and what the Bible says. All right, part of this is just a given, that we are still sinful people, that we are being sanctified just like everybody else. But what do we do when our pastors, perhaps not just once or twice, but have a habitual pattern of speaking or thinking or behaving in a way that is unbecoming of the holiness without which none shall see the Lord, right? When your pastor deals with real temptations and struggles and sins, how are you to deal with them? All right, are you just supposed to shut up and put up? Are you supposed to submit to him? Are you supposed to say, well, if my pastor's doing it, clearly that means I can do it? Are you supposed to follow in those bad examples? Well, the resounding answer to all of those is no, not at all. Right? But rather, if you believe that your pastor, your elders are in a particular sin, right, you need to really weigh out in your heart, is this a legitimate sin, or is this just by preference? Right now, speaking from experience, I can tell you that when it comes to a pastor, there are innumerable preferences. I'm not stoking any ill feelings or trying to play a small violin. I've had people comment on my glasses, on whether or not I should or shouldn't wear glasses, on the shirts that I wear, on the ties that I should or shouldn't wear, on whether or not I should have facial hair or not have facial hair, to the type of color of car that I should be driving, and the colors that I shouldn't be driving, and where I should live and where I shouldn't live. All right, there are innumerable preferences and expectations that people hold their pastors to. And so the first question that congregants ought to deal with very honestly is this just a preference that I have, or is this a legitimate issue of sin in the pastor's life? And once one has honestly and prayerfully dealt with that, if you still believe this isn't a preference, but that indeed this is an issue of sin and legitimate sin, then the second question you ought to ask yourself is, can this sin be overlooked in love? Right? That doesn't mean excusing sin, but it's holding to the principle that the Apostle Peter laid down in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8, where he said that love covers over a multitude of sin. And not every sin that your pastor commits needs to be dragged to the light and needs to be addressed. And actually, I think it was Charles Spurgeon once noted, and this is a real loose paraphrase, I read it many years ago, right, is that by the time somebody confronts him on sin, he said, right, that his typical response is, I'm thankful that you confronted me on this, but if you knew even the half of it, All right, he said that by the time he's usually confronted, he's already been deeply convicted of a sin. And so the question is, do these sins need to be addressed, or can they be overlooked in love? Just as your pastor and your elders overlook numerous sins that they see in your life, right? Sins that don't necessarily need to be dragged to the light at the present moment, because love can cover over a multitude of sin. Love can believe and hope what is best. Again, that's not excusing sin, but is just asking, is there a legitimate place to walk in the freeness of forgiveness and love? Can this offense be overlooked? All right, so that's a second question. Now, there are times, perhaps many times, many more than we'd like to admit, where we can't overlook sins. All right, and so the biblical requirement here is that when you can't overlook a sin in love, and you can't forgive it in that way, then the only alternative is to confront. And I would say you can confront your pastor as well, or another elder who lives in sin. Now, this is a place where many churches struggle, all right, because there are many people who can't overlook sins in love, but who also don't confront the sin. And so they're left in this middle ground area that the Bible never commends or even commands, and it usually comes out in anger, resentment, or bitterness, or talking behind people's backs and saying, listen, my pastor did this, said that, etc., etc., right? The Bible gives us two approaches in dealing with sin, and that's either to overlook it in love, or it is to confront the erring brother or sister. And so if you think that your pastor, one of your elders, is in sin, confront your elder. All right, go up to your elder and sit down very humbly, very kindly, graciously, all for his good, and express your concern, right, as a concern, not as an accusation, not as a judgment, but to draw to light that there are particular words or behaviors that you believe are sinful. I know that there have been a couple times in my ministry where people have done this, and where they have a legitimate reason. I'm very, very grateful for it. There's other times where somebody will perceive a sin in me, and we'll sit down and we'll talk about it, and they'll see that, okay, they were mistaken, right? And no worse for the wear. I don't think any less of those people whatsoever. I actually probably think more of them, because they see me and they see the concern that they ought to have for my conduct, that how I live, my way of life would be in keeping with what I preach. So how do you deal with a pastor when he isn't living a good example? Well, first, right, you ask, is this really a sin or is this a preference? If it's a sin, then you're left with two options. You can overlook it in love, which really does mean overlook it in love. It doesn't mean store it up in your heart and grow bitter and resentful, or wash your hands of the church and walk away from it, right? But can you honestly overlook it in love? Or secondly, you go and you confront in great humility and out of a desire for your pastor's well-being, out of a genuine love for him, and confront him on these sins if need be. And so the second rule that Owen lays down here for the duties of Christian fellowship, as it pertains to congregants' duties or responsibilities to their pastor, is that the pastor's way of life is to be observed and carefully followed to the extent that he walks in the way of Jesus Christ. Well, I hope this chapter has been beneficial to you. I look forward to our next video where we will go on with the third rule of how congregants are to fulfill their duties to their pastors. Have a wonderful day.